In 2019, the Communist Party of China released an animated web series based on the life of Karl Marx called The Leader. While often referred to as a Karl Marx anime, I'd think that the label of anime is only applicable to imperialist propaganda from Japan, while this, let's call it Chiname, professes the true values of socialism with Chinese characteristics openly. No joke, at the end of the last episode, it draws a link between the life of Karl Marx and the continuing legacy of the sinification of Marxism-Leninism under the leadership of Xi Jinping's new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I have to admire the Chinese Communist Party for being so open about the message they are trying to get across. Oftentimes, people will accuse the series of being pro-communist propaganda. And while this is true in the sense that it was literally produced by a propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party, I would like to instead focus on the propaganda aspect in the neutral sense of the word of what message these Chinese departments were trying to get across, because it might be different than what people who were quick to call it propaganda initially thought. The series was entirely in Mandarin, and you would need to rely on translated English subtitles to view it. So obviously it was intended for internal Chinese consumption rather than an international audience. While the series portrays Marx's life in a sympathetic light, which is arguably biased, there are any number of biographies which do exactly that. That angle does not interest me so much as the intended message the Chinese Communist Party wants the Chinese to think about Marxism and how effective it may be at that. We haven't even begun, and yet we can just look at the title of the series and see what they wanted people to take away. The Leader can seem like an innocuous enough title as simply being pro-Marx. But from within the context of socialism, asserting someone even can be the leader in the first place is a political position that boxes out all forms of socialism which assert that there are to be no leaders at all. Marx in his own words would be more accurately described as a philosopher, economist, or at most a revolutionary theorist. While he did assert that there would be a period of dictatorship of the proletariat following the revolution, such as the Paris Commune, which is an example featured in the penultimate episode of this series. The Commune, while it had a leadership, did not follow any particular ideology, and many factions followed philosophies Marx denounced earlier in the series. The dictatorship of the proletariat meant a dictatorship by a particular class as a whole, rather than specifically a dictatorship by a particular leader or party. While afterwards Marx did assert that the Commune should have followed his ideas more closely and forcefully, Leninism was the ideology which put forth that the revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat should be led by a particular vanguard party. Since Marxism-Leninism is the ideology of the Communist Party of China, this series is specifically propaganda of the Leninist state, justifying itself. They retroactively place Marx at the beginning of a line of leaders that includes Lenin, Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and finally Xi Jinping. The inclusion of the current leader of China is not incidental, as two previous leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, were not given a place by name in the way Xi Jinping thought is given in the official ideology list. Instead, their contributions are called the Three Represents and A Scientific Outlook on Development, respectively. It may seem as if I'm obsessing over small details, like over-explaining a single word that is just the title. But to quote a biography of Stalin I can no longer track down, but I read in my high school library on my lunch breaks, in case you ever need another reason as to why you should be nice to the loner kid. It was not opposition to socialism that Stalin was afraid of. In fact, if the Tsar came back tomorrow, Stalin would welcome it. But what kept Stalin up at night was the prospect of better socialism than he was providing. The socialist state must legitimize itself within the context of socialism, and so these small details that distinguish variants might go above the head of those outside the context. Some may argue that China is not at all socialist, and thus object to me calling it that. But that is why it is all the more important to understand how it is they are making it appear as if they are. When you think Karl Marx anime, a dandelion and a dove is not exactly what comes to mind. In fact, the aesthetics are so non-industrial that it almost reminds me of Heidi, or even Frankenstein. The book version, not the, In the one I'm talking about, Victor Frankenstein leaves his rural German village to go study in the city, clashes with the established authorities, and creates a monster. But what we actually learn is that the real monster is man himself. Wait. To be fair, I'm just listing off fictional examples of Victorian-era Central Europe. And if you are going to make a story in that era and time period, you're going to run into the same imagery. So it's probably unfair that I was expecting something more steampunk. The three people pictured in the opening are of course Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Jenny von Westphalen, who was the wife of Marx. The series focuses on Marx's lifelong relationships with these people. The first episode begins with Engels giving the eulogy at Marx's funeral, which serves as a bookend as the series also nears its end in the same way. We are immediately brought to Marx giving a commencement speech at his secondary school graduation in Trier, a town in Germany near the border with Luxembourg. During the speech, he looks upon Jenny and is transported back to his childhood, where they would play together and he would read her Shakespeare, such as the tragedy of Timon of Athens, who was a man so wealthy and so generous They could even pay off people's debts, just so they could come attend a party he was throwing. Timon went broke, giving away so much money. But since he thought himself so well liked, he believed he had nothing to fear, since he could simply ask his friends to return the favor, which of course they did not. Unfortunately for them, he borrowed money to throw one last banquet, which turned out to be a ruse intended to chastise them for not helping him. Ironic, he could save others from debt, but not himself. Similar in structure to Frankenstein, the series is enclosed by 3 layers of bookends. First, there is Engels at the funeral telling the story of Marx, similar to how Victor Frankenstein recounts his tale to the North Pole explorer. Then within this second layer, Frankenstein's monster tells his own tale to Victor Frankenstein, just as Marx reminisces about Jenny at his commencement. Then within this third layer, they both further read some other work, such as Timon of Athens, or Paradise Lost in the monster's case. Then the successive layers of snapshots are collapsed into one, as the audience wonders how we got into these situations. After graduation, Marx attends a party hosted by Jenny's aristocratic von Westphalen family. They were obviously going for the romance across classes angle here, evidenced by the first episode being titled, Different Youth. Marx is made to feel unwelcome at the high-class party. While an attempt was made to give Marx proletarian class credentials, the man was thoroughly bourgeois to the core. His cousin even founded the Philips Electronics Company, which today is valued in the tens of billions of dollars. So if there was something to this division they were going for, it was not poor versus rich so much as old versus new money. Marx proposes to Jenny secretly, but he has to go off to University of Bonn to study, where he learns about Kant's philosophy, and how because of it nothing can escape criticism. And so, just like Donald Trump, Marx becomes a Kantian. I kid you not, there's a Goodwill Hunting scene where one of Marx's friends gets intercepted while talking to some woman at a bar by a local aristocrat who thinks the Trierr folk are a bunch of country bumpkins. So the aristocrat asks the friend what he thinks about the conflict between dogmatism and skepticism. Marx then goes all, how do you like them apples on them, and explains both those concepts originated with Kant, and then completes the system of German idealism right in front of them, and trips them up by asking if a person saying, I am lying, is telling the truth, and then the aristocrat disappeared in a puff of logic. He then buys everyone at the bar drinks. Unfortunately, Marx was terrible with money, because of course he was. His father told him he was spending his money way too frivolously, and so transferred him to the far more serious University of Berlin, where he became Hegelian while fencing with his friend Bruno Bauer, discovering that the sword of dialectics can overcome all obstacles in his path. Marx joined Bauer's Doctors Club, named so because they were working towards their Doctor of Philosophy, or PhD, which at the time was a relatively new concept invented by the Prussian university system, which later spread throughout the world. The Doctors Club became the Young Hegelians, who thought they could advance the Hegelian dialectics as opposed to the old Hegelians, who were a bunch of boomers who thought it had already reached the highest plane of truth. In the second episode, Marx shows Bauer his doctorate thesis advocating atheism called The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. Bauer tells him that his paper might not be accepted due to its atheism, which is being suppressed by the conservative university leadership, and suggests Marx obscure his position to get past the censors. But Marx refuses to change his writing, so Bauer instead suggests he submit the dissertation to the University of Jena instead because they would be friendlier to Epicurus and atheism, and then suggests Marx go work for the liberal bourgeois Rheinische Zeitung, or Rhenish newspaper in Cologne. While the newspaper is a success, Marx's writings gets the paper in trouble with the Prussian government. An officer shows up to interrogate Marx over the supposed rumors he is publishing about the governor. Marx demands the officer bet the governor's reputation by shooting him then and there, and thus the officer backs down. To my knowledge, I don't think anything like this happened, and seems to be a dramatization of the general suppression of the paper. It seems a bit ironic given the state of press freedom in China, which is often justified as preventing the spread of rumors, which, as you may know, contributed to them suppressing the news of the spread of something else we have become all too familiar with in 2020. I don't know, maybe the irony was intentional as a way of obscuring the position of the creators to get past the censors. Marx discusses with Bauer the passage of a new forestry law making it illegal for peasants to collect branches, and states that Hegel was wrong that the state was rationally in the interest of the majority of people, and rather that the law is merely the tool of the landed to protect their own interests. Bauer says Marx shouldn't concern himself with minor issues, so Marx calls the young Hegelians a bunch of fedoras who will publicly mock priests, but have lost the drive to fight for genuine political freedoms. Marx tells Bauer he will fight for the rights of the people, and challenge this unjust world directly, and so he is rejecting the young Hegelians. Bauer, offended, leaves, but not before warning Marx that he is already in trouble with the government, and to not go this alone. And as he walks through the door, he bumps past none other than Friedrich Engels on his way in. The symbolism being lost on nobody, Engels tells Marx that his writing is thought-provoking, and says they used to both be members of the Young Hegelians, and he would like to speak with him. Since Marx is now racist against young Hegelians, he tells a disappointed Engels that he's too busy. The Prussian government informs the shareholders of Marx's newspaper that they are to be censored, so Marx resigns and heads off to Paris with the only young Hegelian he still considers worth anything, Arnold Rouge, who organizes a stipend to cover Marx's living expenses so he could bring Jenny along to get married. Also seeking to escape censorship, Engels submits his Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy to the Franco-German journal, which catches Marx's attention. He's impressed that he is the son of a factory owner who wants to fight for the workers, and has similar views to Marx. What? A bourgeois who likes the writings of Marx? I'm shocked. While hanging out in a Parisian cafe with other German exiles, such as poet Heinrich Heine, Marx has a falling out of Rouge when Marx keeps saying how religion is the opiate of the masses, and they need to be weaned off of it with a new philosophy that can enable them to take control of their own lives, and the need for there to be a revolution of the poor. Rouge chastises him about how he has risen the fury of the Prussian government, and asks how they can save the poor when they can't even save themselves. And once again, when Rouge walks out of Marx's life, he bumps past Engels. Marx apologizes for ignoring him when he was mad at the young Hegelians, and they immediately begin to hit it off when they ask each other why Engels isn't making money running a factory, or Marx being a lawyer like their fathers, and instead advocating for the poor. They say that it is because the poor have strength, and with the weapon of philosophy they could rise up and liberate the whole world. They say that the workers are alienated from the product of their labor, which enriches only the capitalists. Engels says that the workers in Silesia, a part of Prussia that is in modern-day Poland, have already risen up and demanded the abolition of private property. These movements have been called workers' communism, or some say socialism, which resemble utopians such as Charles Fourier, but Marx says they are closer to that of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who wrote of scientific socialism, which contrasts with the utopians. Marx and Engels decry the fact that socialist theories up to this date are insufficient. They are either against taking action or merely discuss economics. They say that they need to not just formally outline a theory of scientific socialism, they must push for the revolution towards it. They must use philosophy to forge a new world view for the workers that they can use as a weapon of criticism so that the proletariat may use their material force to overthrow the material force of the bourgeoisie. The weapon of criticism will lead to the criticism by weapons. They mock the young Hegelians for thinking their criticisms alone will drag the Hegelian dialectic forward, and they pen the Critique of Critical Critique, where they make fun of Bruno Bauer and Ossa Max Stirner by calling them a family of holy figures due to their apparent obsession with merely criticizing spooks as if they could perform an exorcism that changes society by removing them. After 10 days, Engels has to leave and eventually Marx is forced into exile in Belgium by France, under the pressure of the Prussian government. There, the Marx family housekeeper, Helen de Muff, while making dough, tells Jenny that Marx isn't making nearly enough dough, and so they won't be able to afford the ingredients to make dough next month after paying rent. How you can both be broke and have a housekeeper is something that requires a bit of context. And to be honest, I'm surprised they even included it given all the questions she raises, or doesn't. Helen de Muff was a peasant girl who was sent by Jenny's aristocratic Westphalian mother to go live with them in Belgium. Just as Jenny and Helen are discussing the financial situation, Engels comes for a visit and says that the sales of the Holy Family, mocking Bauer, have come in, so Marx and Jenny don't need to worry about money no more. Jenny mentioned that maybe some of that money should go to Ludwig Feuerbach, an anthropologist who criticized religion on materialist grounds, and made it easy to criticize the young Hegelians' idealistic criticisms of religion. Marx, however, states that he has become critical of the fact that Feuerbach restricts his materialism to the natural sphere, but does not extend it to society or history, saying thus that he is still an idealist. Marx contends that history is the product of human actions, and so can be changed through practice. Engels agrees and says dialectics need to be applied to history, and that they should be combined with materialism, a dialectical materialism, if you will. While Marx walks with him lamenting censorship, Engels points out that they are being followed, likely due to their contacts with the Chartists in London. Marx says that revolutionary activity can take a back seat for now, but theorizing must go faster, claiming that the alternative socialist theories are deluding the people, and that past philosophical beliefs need to be completely removed and replaced with a completely new German ideology, separate from Hegel's idealism and Feuerbach's materialism. Unfortunately, Engels informs Marx that nobody wants to publish this, the German ideology. From now on, great repetitive focus is placed on the disputes Marxism has with other socialist theories, which does exemplify the rather strange obsession among communist states to claim that they are following the true socialism that results in two camps of them declaring each other revisionists, and then later calling their split partners revisionists as well, thus leaving little Albania out on a lurch alone to build endless bunkers when Nixon goes to China after Albania backed the revisionist horse in the Sino-Soviet split. For all the talk of other theories sending the workers away from the path of revolution, they also talk about advancing theory as an alternative to immediate revolution. The message at the end of the series makes it clear that China continues to advance the theory of Marxism through the Sinification up to the current Xi Jinping thought for a new era, which allows them to claim that conditions simply aren't right yet in order to justify all the decidedly non-socialist things China does. Simultaneously, they can criticize others for not being revolutionary enough, so long as they can say the alternative theory being advanced is not a revolutionary theory. The revolution is coming at some point, trust me. Oh, but that other guy, he's never going to bring revolution, because of his theory he is following. They can thus assign revolutionary states or reactionary states simply based on theoretical framework that never needs to actually pass. And then the actions of those states are evaluated whether they are a priori defined as revolutionary or reactionary, or revisionist if they have a falling out. Within the context of socialism in this series, both criticisms are used to knock out rivals. One, that the conditions are not right yet, or two, that they refuse to pounce on the right conditions. In defense of Marxism, you could make the claim that in actuality, it is true that they are the only ones who actually know when the conditions will be right, because their theory is scientific. But just look at the track record, 0-4, what is it up to now? To be fair though, I suppose they only need to be right once. The next episode begins with an economic crisis, and so there's a specter haunting Europe. But this specter is not nearly communist enough yet. Rather, the everlasting dispute within the socialists is raging, leading the workers' movement astray, and rendering them ineffective. Specifically name-dropped are Hermann Krieg, our old friend Proudhon, who originally came up with scientific socialism beforehand despite this episode claiming that this is its debut, and Wilhelm Wittling, founder of the League of the Just and a proponent of Christian communism, who advocated the proletariat directly challenge the nobility without the help of the bourgeoisie, and thus established communism directly. Marx chastises him for ignoring objective historical conditions, which state it is much too early to do that, and attempting to do this only will lead to suffering and blood for the proletariat, for a pointless endeavor. Wittling calls Marx pedantic, and says the bourgeoisie is the enemy of the proletariat, and he should never compromise with the enemy. Marx accuses Wittling of believing himself some divinely inspired prophet, ignoring all strategic concerns. Wittling, in turn, calls Marx a coward, and insists the workers need no theory, and thousands marching can establish a German communist revolution through their passion alone. While reading a newspaper, Marx expresses his frustration to Engels about true socialists, like Hermann Krieg, talking about love dozens of times in an article insisting that it is all that is needed to unify the people, complaining that it is dulling the workers to their exploitation, and saying how absurd it is to use love to move the hearts of usurers. They say they will use the Communist Correspondence Committee organization to control these true socialists, to prevent them from misleading the workers, which already operates in London and Brussels, but needs to expand to Paris, as it would be the core of the communist movement. For that, they would need to enlist the help of Proudhon to establish a Parisian committee. But Marx is distraught to inform him that he's been writing to Proudhon, and he seems too indifferent, and he has sent Marx a lengthy critique. So Engels says that he will go meet Proudhon in person, while Marx could stay in Brussels to promote the movement over there. In Brussels, Marx meets with a watchmaker and member of the League of the Just, from Cologne, who is called Moore. While there's a Samuel Moore who translated the Communist Manifesto into English, the only watchmaker from Cologne in Marx's life was a guy called Joseph Moll. Perhaps they got confused with pronunciation and translation, as even when they say Marx, it sounds more like Marcus. Regardless, Moll informs Marx that the League of the Just are distancing themselves from Wittling's plotting and insurrection, and instead are going to follow Marx's theory of a scientific communism, and he invites him to join the organization that will eventually become the Communist League. When Engels returns from Paris, he informs Marx that the trip went poorly, and he was arrested for supposedly promoting violence at workers' meetings, and all he managed to bring back was a copy of Proudhon's Philosophy of Poverty. Proudhon's mutualist theories state that all the workers need to do is establish people's banks which lend without interest, and then the contradiction between workers and capitalists will go away. Proudhon claims that no governments are even necessary, and that through peaceful reforms, a petit bourgeois socialism will be possible with a small-scale manufacturing base. Marx quips that Proudhon's Philosophy of Poverty is really just a poverty of philosophy, and writes a lengthy rebuttal. While Marx writes this scathing rebuke, Engels goes to London to attend the League of the Just, where he meets with Wilhelm Liebknecht, the founder of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. There, the League agrees to abandon considering their views and formally becomes the Communist League, and Engels writes the principles of communism for their program. Marx says that it is a bit dry like a textbook, so they agree to write a more passionate communist manifesto together. The narrator claims that after the manifesto was published, this was the birth of scientific socialism, and that the people of various European countries all rose up in 1848 in revolution against the ruling class. But as previously stated, scientific socialism had existed beforehand, and the people were likely rising up in 1848 for all sorts of reasons anyway. But despite this, since the Communist Manifesto was one of those that were openly published, the Belgian king associated the revolts with Marx, and so he was exiled to Paris, where the Second Republic had succeeded in establishing itself, and was invited by the new minister, Ferdinand Flocon, who stated that France was the center of revolution. Later, even censorship and exiles in Prussia were removed as part of the reforms, so Marx established his new Rhenish newspaper to use the pen to make the guns smarter, so as to avoid failures like the Hecker Uprising, led by the likes of poets such as George Heweg. Incidentally, that Joseph Moll guy, who is likely the identity of the Moor in the series, was killed in the fighting in Baden. The new Rhenish Zeitung is brought before a libel court for publishing the words of Attorney General Zweifel, stating that they should roll back the reforms of the March 1848 revolution. Despite being a direct quote, the judge says that this article has caused harm to the public reputation of the Attorney General. Engels and Marx state that if you can be accused of libel for directly quoting someone, and you need to wait for a court's decision before publishing anything about an important issue, then there's no point in having freedom of the press. Again, this seems as if the writers of the series might be trying to sneak in criticism over China's censorship policies, as China claims to have freedom of the press, but operates in much a way similar to how it is described in the Prussian system. But alternatively, they might also just simply be blind to the apparent hypocrisy. The jury, however, found the newspaper innocent, and the government was not able to get them shut down for urging the boycott over taxes. By 1849, the paper escalated to urging the people directly overthrow the king, and so they were exiled once more. Marx states that this experience has convinced him that the bourgeois-led reforms will not be sufficient, and that the proletariat must seize power for themselves. And so he returns to Paris to continue writing while Engels meets up with Liebknecht and the other revolutionaries in Baden. But Marx fears he will not be able to stay in Paris for much longer. The new Rhenish newspaper publishes its final May edition in red ink before being shut down. In the next episode, there's a 5-year time skip, and Marx begins his transformation of turning into hungry Santa Claus by growing a beard and being unable to afford bread, and instead only being able to get potatoes after pawning his coat for money. One of his children is sick, so Marx wants to use the money from his coat to go get a doctor, but his landlady says that he still owes half of last month's rent, and wants the money to go to her, or they will be evicted. The kids offer to give her the potatoes, and Jenny and the maid offer to work for the landlady. Again, we're in a situation where you can somehow simultaneously have a maid and be unable to afford even bread, but that sort of thing was probably a lot more common back then, I have to assume. Thankfully, Engels shows up just in the nick of time with the money to bail Marx out of the tricky financial situation he's found himself in, but not soon enough, as Marx's sick child dies shortly after. Marx is angered that the era he's living in would allow this, as they have lost 3 children in 5 years, because obviously losing children is the only thing that happened in his era and not in any era before that. He laments that he has fought for the downtrodden and oppressed his whole life, but he can't even provide his own children. Engels and Jenny assure him that this is precisely why he has chosen the right path, and so that his children will not have died in vain, he must continue the fight so that this never happens to anyone's children ever again. While researching in the British Museum, Marx confronts a coughing young boy who is working as a cleaner. The boy's name is Tom, and reminds Marx of his deceased son, as they would be about the same age. The boy asks Marx why they can't have coal for heat at home when his father works at a coal mine, but was fired because the boss said there was too much coal being produced. The boy is confused because he thinks that with more coal, the mine should be able to sell it for more money, and his father should not have lost his job, and could be buying more coal now. Marx starts explaining capital and the labor theory value to the boy, and that his dad's surplus value was taken away from him by the boss, because the boss owns the coal mine and the worker owns nothing. He says the secret the boss won't tell him is that there actually isn't too much coal. Rather, the poor who want coal can't afford it, while the rich who can afford it don't need that much coal. And so it only seems like there is too much coal being produced. This creates a relative surplus value, and so the boss can't make a profit, so he needs to cut back production and fire workers. The boy asks why the boss can't just sell the coal for a cheap price to the people who need it, and Marx says that they won't do that because they won't make as much profit. Marx tells the boy that the workers need to learn his secret and take the factories back from the bosses so the workers can be in charge, and says that if he could read, this would all be in his critique of political economy that he's writing. As for that name, Marx writes to Engels that this is not exactly descriptive, and states that his mother is always telling him that he should spend more time acquiring some capital rather than always writing about it, which gave him the idea to call it Das Kapital. However, Marx becomes my spirit animal and is unable to publish anything for years as his needs to be perfect. Engels admires Marx's pursuit of perfection, but insists that the workers need his writings, and the time is right for them. So Marx agrees to publish the first volume. The episode then unironically has a segment where a vampiric present echoes the words of the bourgeoisie and contrasts with Marx's words, illuminating the true nature of the system of capital. And in this process, Marx enters his final form as an old man when he completes Volume 1. In the next episode, the First International gets up and running, and the Prussian government of Bismarck invites all sorts of exiles back to work for his government. But Marx turns it down, because he will be required to support the government in order to work for it. Shortly thereafter, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and the Second French Empire was defeated. The Third French Republic was established, and it signed an armistice with the Prussians. and Paris rose up in revolt against the provisional French government and established the Paris Commune. Marx claims that this is the first example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, who seized control after the French bourgeoisie betrayed them to the Prussians. Tom, the boy Marx spoke to, is now grown up and heads to Paris to fight for the Commune. The series makes it seem as if the suppression of the Commune was the Prussians, by saying the Prussians specifically released prisoners of war to form the army to retake the city for the bourgeois, who self-interestedly were working with the Prussians against the French people. But the release of these soldiers was already part of the armistice that was signed that the Parisians were revolting against in the first place, alongside the various financial laws that were being put in place to collect the reparations money required to get the Prussians to leave France. Throughout the series, Prussia has been repeatedly set up as a center of reaction, while France has been set up as a center of revolution. This is done to justify the Leninist concept of a revolutionary state by piling up responsibility onto states described as reactionary. As Leninism gives way to Maoism, increasing focus is placed on the idea of imperialism as the primary contradiction. In this case, the reparation payments made to the Prussians, even though the French Empire under Napoleon III was the aggressor in that war. But the Chinese considered it imperialism when the North Korean invasion was pushed back beyond the original borderline during the Korean War, so they never been ones to care about who technically started a war. Emphasis is placed on the bourgeoisie betrayal of the nation to the deemed reactionary countries of Prussia, or in China's case, Japan, as the true wrongdoing. And just like that, the seeming contradiction of placing a star on the Chinese flag for the nationally based bourgeoisie evaporates so long as they stand against what they consider to be imperialism. Additionally, the grown-up Tom, who is probably entirely made up, writes to Marx informing him that the Commune is struggling due to a lack of an authoritative leadership. This, along with the earlier usage of the party organization to control those true socialists, always writing about love, justifies the Leninist concept of democratic centralism, which is how the dictatorship of the proletariat, as is understood by Leninism, operates under a vanguard party, as the decisions reached by the party are binding on all its members, and then the party members exercise their vanguardist role in the institutions of the country. After writing a eulogy to the Paris Commune called The Civil War in France, Marx tells Engels that it has been 25 years since the Communist Manifesto has been published, and much of it is now out of date based on the experience of the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune, and that they should emphasize this to the reader in the preface, saying that they must not just criticize others, but they should also engage in self-criticism. And Engels adds that the manifesto itself says that the application of theory must always adapt to the prevailing historical conditions. This focus on the notion of self-criticism is the most insidious aspect of all this, given the concept's crucial role in the struggle sessions from the Mao era. Struggle sessions were later disowned under Deng Xiaoping, which is where the concept of adapting to prevailing historical conditions can be used to justify literally anything, including backtracking on what you're precisely doing, as you can claim the party has always been in the right based on the specific historical conditions of the time, even if you denounce doing the same today. In particular, that Xi Jinping's addition to the official theory is appended by "for a new era" emphasizes this point as an explanation for why it might not have anything to do with what the party considered correct thought before. Marx tells Engels that there's also some bad news, and Marx channels Master Ugwe and says that he doesn't like this vulgar dialectic of "if it's not good, it's bad." And then Engels tells him the objectively bad news for them that the emperors of Germany, Austria, and Russia are cracking down on the First Internationale. Additionally, Marx states that Mikhail Bakunin is causing trouble trying to split the organization from the inside. Engels suggests they talk to Bakunin directly, while Marx has the genius terror idea for keeping the organization united by debating him publicly at the First International meeting. Marx passive-aggressively says that someone is trying to split the organization, and Bakunin puts him out of his misery and tells him that he can just speak to him directly, and says his issue is with Marx's idea that the political power of the state apparatus ought to be seized rather than destroyed. Bakunin believes this will simply lead to continued oppression under a different name. Marx reverses this claim on Bakunin by accusing him of advocating for anarchy, all the while he conspires with other anarchists to create an elite faction within an organization that serves as secret aristocracy, and so Marx proposes that Bakunin and his alliance be expelled from the organization. And just like that, with the final boss defeated, and all 12 of the combat crystals captured by Marx, he could reach the final stage of dialectical materialism and reign supreme as the undisputed master of the left. The final episode begins with the long arm of Marx telling Jenny about how successful the sales of Capital have been going, and that it even made its way into Russia past the censors since they assumed it was merely an economics text. As the leaves of autumn fall, Engels informs Marx about Düring publicly challenging them, and so the denouement is not without trial. Marx says that Düringism is no different than what Ferdinand Lassalle was peddling all those years before, but they never published their critique of that Gotha program openly to preserve party unity. Since Marx needs to focus on Capital 2 and 3, Engels agrees to write the criticism of Düring, Marx begins taking notes of what will become On the Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State, while Jenny's health and memory deteriorates. And she begins to believe that they're back at the beginning of their relationship once again. And Marx assures her that they will be together for a long time, but that it will be a tough life in exile where they couldn't even save their own children, and ask her if she would still be with him, knowing all this. As you can tell, this episode is primarily just fluff, so she says, "Oh, as long as you love me." The trees continue to become bare as Marx has to bury Jenny, and he died just over a year later, but not before his daughter died of cancer. The fire of Marx's life goes out, and under bare trees, we close the final bookend, and Engels is once again giving a eulogy to Marx. In the 11 years after the death of Marx, Engels continued his work using Marx's notes, and in a very unmaterialist way, Engels sees and begins speaking to the spirit of Marx in his office, and tells him how he has published volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, and that despite his friends saying that he is working too hard, this work makes him happy because while doing it, he feels as if he is with his old friend once more. The narrator then traces the work of Marx to the October Revolution in Russia, establishing the first communist state, and then to China, where it is synthesized by the CCP, who have combined his principles with the concrete realities of China, continually advancing the sinification of Marxism, developing Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the three represents for Jiang Zemin, and a scientific outlook of development for Hu Jintao, and finally with Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And then it repeats itself saying that the sinification of Marxism will continue under the leadership of Xi Jinping thought for a new era, bringing China into a new era. Have I said new era enough? It then ends by saying that the flag of Marxism must be raised high and bring about the society envisioned by Marx and Engels in China. To review this as a piece of animation, I can say that it bashes you over the head in symbolism, and appears to have been made on a low budget, with mistakes and general choppiness. It's not like I could have done a better job, but you kind of expect the largest government in the world to be able to produce something of higher quality than some random YouTubers. As propaganda, it manages as well as it does with the symbolism, as it doesn't hide what it is trying to say. On a personal level, I actually like unabashed propaganda over the covert stuff, so I guess point for having conviction even if it's not the most effective. As a telling of Marx's life, I think that is where it is strongest. I like that it focuses on stringing together Marx's work as a measuring stick of his life, but I think the overt focus on Marx's relationship with Jenny and Engels goes over the top in the same way it is heavy-handed with the symbolism. Although I have to admit, I found the part about Engels finishing Marx's work being like he was with his old friend again touching. It's possible that a sense of irony is not as well developed in a restricted society like that of China, so while it is still possible to be sincere over there, it will also lack self-awareness. Either that, or we can't even imagine how many levels of irony they are on right now to get all things past the censors. Marx, no! If you throw your notes everywhere, how is Engels going to finish Das Kapital?